Hello, I'm Dr. Tony Rigling, and I want to welcome you to this year's virtual law symposium. I hope that in the future we'll be able to see each other once again in person. Hopefully, next year, all the COVID concerns and safety concerns will have dissipated and we can meet in person as usual at the Brown here in Louisville. Um, I always find it fun and interesting and always educational to be able to chat with my peers. So I hope that you will enjoy that experience yourself next year. As we begin today, we're going to talk about your school safety profile, and how to make sure that you have a good safety profile and you're comfortable with what it is, and how you will respond in the event of unfortunate circumstances or natural disasters. As we begin, we want to acknowledge that this is co-sponsored by the Loyola Marymount University and the National Catholic Education Association. We thank them both for their sponsorship over the years, and we couldn't do this without their help. And so we are very grateful for the fact that they are here today. Our objective today are to discuss these four things. And by way of starting with the ICS, which stands for Incident Command System, I want you to think back. Many of us have heard or seen that old radio program, little skit about who's on first, where everybody uses the English language, but they use it in such a way as to create um, a very funny misunderstanding between the two people, Abbott and Costello, who are performing that routine. So, with that in mind, um, the incident command system grew out of FEMA experience, coordinating with local and regional authorities as they tried to mitigate or recover from disasters. And some were natural, some were man made. What they discovered was they needed a standard framework and language because people in different regions and people in different jurisdictions were using different terms for the same thing, and it created great confusion when you needed help from outside your region. The other thing they decided and discovered was that you had to have a scalable response. Sometimes you might have a simple fire, which is at a factory or a building and quite easily handled locally. Sometimes there was a widespread flood, and you had to have several jurisdictions involved in that as waters rose and fell across a wide range of territories and up and down many, many, many hundreds of miles in a river. You could have something like a train derailment, which might be localized, but it would involve so many different people that you needed to have so much expertise of a specialized nature that it was very confusing if everyone spoke a different language and no one could understand exactly what the other was telling you. And then, of course, hurricanes, which are very widespread, often oftentimes between many different states, all of whom had their own jurisdictions before FEMA came up with the incident command system to unify what was going on. And the idea was to have common procedures used wherever possible. Um, though many events are unique, they have so many things in common. Members for the staff had to meet rigorous training requirements. There are many, many courses that FEMA specifies if you're going to be a member of the staff, and they are also required. There are also required renewals of your certification. In other words, you have to participate in either an exercise or an actual event in order to stay current, um, because there are always modifications as we attempt to keep the procedures and plans as current as possible. And members from different organizations and regions can come together to make an effective team because we've all had the same training. I myself am certified to be an administrative and finance section chief, which means I get to take care of all the paperwork, keeping people in and out and paying all the bills, which can sometimes be considerable depending on the event you're talking about. So a standard management hierarchy, pre-established and sanctioned, well-trained, interdisciplinary. Those are the features of the incident command system. Why does it matter to you? Well, many of our schools are in different jurisdictions, and they have many different organizations that they would coordinate with. Uh, in some cases, in our diocese, we have many, many counties and many, many different cities. Within a city, you might, or within a county, you might have different cities and police departments from those different cities or fire departments from those different cities might respond to your school. Um, so it helps if we understand the language that they use because they use a common language. Okay. Um, how do they plan and react together is just exactly what the incident command system is about. So, first of all, it provides us that common language. It's a common set of expectations. If I ask someone to do something, then my expectation is that they will do it. Um, there is a concept called unity of command, which means at any given time there is one and only one person in charge of the response system that is taking place and all of the activities within that system. This avoids the unfortunate circumstances of one person saying do something this way, another person saying do something that way, and then the resources are um, double tasked, and of course they can't do two things at once, and so that diminishes their effectiveness. But it can also get people hurt if they get into each other's way in a way that is unsafe. It gives them a more focused response. It increases the safety of the response, and there is common training available so that we can do all of this. Um, FEMA is the lead agency. If you would like to have FEMA training, and I recommend that you do, then you should contact your local emergency management officials. And in some cases, that might be your fire chief or your police chief, or you might have a separate office of emergency readiness, in which case they would know where FEMA training is taking place. You can go to FEMA.gov and look it up on the internet to find out where training is available. And some you can do online, some you have to do in person, but much of it is online. So it makes it very, very flexible for you. So, what would be a typical structure in an incident command system? Well, of course, we have the incident commander. And as I've already said, there's one and only one at a time. And because you can't work 24/7 as an incident commander without taking a little bit of time away from that, there is a specific procedure for handoff and briefing when one incident commander is relieved by another, both equally qualified to be the incident commander. Then these are some offices that you might have here. Uh, Safety, which is always paramount in a rescue operation. We don't want to get people hurt trying to save people if that's at all possible. And public information. And I would recommend to you that you have in your group one and only one person who is allowed to talk to the press or other people. In other words, advise your faculty, students, families not to talk on behalf of the school to describe what is or is not going on. Um, that can lead to great confusion, and it can lead to outright misinformation, even relative to where people should go to pick up kids and things like that. So one and only one person should speak publicly for the institution, and that person should be clearly identified in all of your emergency procedures manuals. You would probably be a liaison, that's a person who is knowledgeable but not in command, and you would provide advice to the incident commander relative to the situation as might be required. And then these are just some things, some offices that happen. Uh, you might or might not need all of these people. You might only need the incident commander. As I say, this is considered a scalable approach. And sometimes this organizational chart would get so big it wouldn't fit on 2 pages. So it changes as the severity of the response and the size of the response changes. And as I said, I myself am trained as a finance and admin section chief. So here's an example. First is fire. Um, you have a fire at your school. Of course, you're in charge right away. You take immediate action to ensure safety and things like that for your students and faculty and families that might be present in the school. But when the fire captain arrives, the fire captain, first on scene, would assume the incident command. Now, what that means is that the fire captain is now in charge, and you should assist the fire captain, but you should not interfere with the fire captain because they know what is going on. Give them enough information that they are aware of all of the critical and important aspects of what's happening right now. Things like location of any dangerous materials, um, where people might be if they're still in the building, where people are who have evacuated the building and might be in need of medical care of some sort, so that he can or she can send someone over to um, assist with their care until we can make a determination if they need to be hospitalized or if it's just a treatment and release type situation. Now, all of that will happen. The police would probably arrive at some point, but the police, because this is a fire, would report to the fire captain or the battalion chief if the fire has been declared large enough for a battalion chief, so that the police are assisting the incident commander in maintaining traffic and safety and security. They would not supplant, and you wouldn't report to the police for one thing and the fire for another. You would report always to the incident commander, who would then know where to place your concerns so that they can be taken care of. As things wind down, eventually the police might be in charge of traffic and the fire folks might be gone. The police would provide security and traffic control around your building. If the building was unsecurable physically, then the police might stay to provide security, and they would be the incident. The one of the police officers on duty would be the incident commander at that point, and you should report and take your cue from the incident commander. Remember, the incident commander may or may not be able to release your building back to you when you want it, but you need to follow their lead um, so that you don't get yourself into trouble or create a dangerous situation. Let's try example number 2. You have an intruder in your school. If that's the case, once again, you're immediately in charge. Uh, and, and this would be a case where the law enforcement folks would take um, precedence and would perform the duty of the incident commander. Um, as soon as they arrive, you would provide all the same type of information. Where are people? Where is the intruder or intruders? How many do you know for sure are in your building? Where might they be? Where might someone be trapped? Have some people evacuated your building? Are some areas of the building empty of anyone who would be not an intruder? So all of that will help the police and the law enforcement determine what to do next and how to proceed. And then once again, after everything is said and done, you might coordinate with police who would control for dismissal and things like that. You would send your kids home, and the police would assist you in traffic control to help do that. So there are phases, and you would just go through the phases. Once again, where can you get training? FEMA is your primary source for most of the classes, but you might find some other classes. There may be some people in your local area who can train. So be, be open to them. I promise you, if you call any of your local disaster response people and say, I'd like training, you will not be bothering them. They will be very happy that you called, because the more people who are properly trained, the better they can do their job, because everybody's on the same page when it comes to something that has happened and how we are going to jointly respond to what has happened. Um, Even organizations like an insurance company or Red Cross can help you. I worked for many years with an insurance company called Catholic Mutual, and they were glad to provide training on various aspects of safety within schools. The Red Cross can provide you with lots of information relative to sheltering and how to organize evacuees from a building and things like that, and what kind of equipment you should take if you're going to have to evacuate your building. As I say, all those resources are available to you, and you should take them up. Now, as you make your safety plan, there are 5 areas that we generally should have in our safety plan. Okay, so let's take a look at it. And you want to always remember that there are priorities. Protecting life is always at the top. As the incident plays out, don't forget that you probably want to be able to get back to school. Um, you want to preserve your critical infrastructure, as vital as that, uh, uh, it, because it is vital for your purpose, and it's unique to your site and location. So it's hard for somebody else to come up with a definition of what constitutes critical infrastructure. Okay, minor injuries that don't endanger loss of life, limb, or a major body function. And if that changes, then you move that injury up to priority number one. So if somebody is hurt, but it's not going to be something that's going to cause them to suffer, loss of function or loss of a body part, or a major injury that's going to turn out to be life-threatening, then you can treat that as a minor injury, and that becomes number three. Um, Make a plan to recover. Where and how? Remember, school is a crime scene, and you can't go back in without the permission of authorities if there has been something like an intruder in the building, or they might suspect that arson was the cause of a fire or something like that. Now, in the case of a natural disaster like a tornado or something of that nature, the building itself might be unsafe just because of structural damage, and you'll need to have the structural engineers clear you back into the building, even to recover property. So be careful about that, because you don't want to have someone get hurt when they could have survived. The United States Department of Energy provided the best baseline plan. It was broken into 3 sections. Um, that you Some topics are um, common to all, and then it talks about the planning process. Okay, so section one, you can see here what the Department of Energy recommends. These are things about who and how and when the plan is going to be made. This is why we make it, and some of our planning assumptions. And that's a very important thing. If you assume, for instance, that you are within 5 minutes or 10 minutes of response from a fire department in case of a fire, or if you're 20 minutes from a fire department, that can change your planning. So you need to look at things like that and figure that out. Concept of operations, how are you going to organize to do this? Who is assigned to what role? Um, who's going to be the boss? In other words, the incident commander. And a word to principals here. Principals are very used to being the person in charge. It is not necessary for you to be the incident commander. You can have someone who is trained as an incident commander in your staff. And if you have retired military or retired civil service like fire or police in your building, they might be a better choice for the incident commander, because they have most likely been trained in the ICS and understand it very well. So you might take a look at that. Um, I know it's hard to not be the one in charge, but in the event of a disaster, you want the person with the most expertise at disaster response running the response to the disaster. Um, so, what kind of information do you need to collect, and what kind of information do you need to give out? When will you train, and how will you train, and what kind of exercises will you do? We're very good at doing our fire drill, earthquake drill, intruder drill, tornado drill. But how many other things do you do? And do you ever do one that lasts for a while? Do you come in the summer and spend a whole day going through actually having an evacuation of the building, taking the students to the place where they would evacuate, and having them picked up by their parents at that location? Um, you might find that you have picked a wonderful location that works beautifully. You might find that you've picked a location that doesn't work so very well because it's difficult to get to, perhaps something that you hadn't thought of because you haven't done it, or um, something, traffic wise or something like that. So it's really important that you practice the things that are in your plan, uh, at least enough so that you have confidence in the fact that they will work. Um, and then admin, finance, and logistics. Do you have the supplies? Do you have the things you need? And how can you put those all together to make the plan? Who's going to be in charge of the plan? Do you have a safety committee? Is there a safety person? Um, how are you going to do that? Does your safety, if you have a committee, does it involve local law enforcement and emergency responders? Like fire or EMS, or is it a committee of, say, experts? You might have some people in your school who work in industry who are quite knowledgeable at how to uh, plan for contingencies, and they would be a very, very great help, and they would be a great resource to have on your committee. And then finally, who has to sign off on this? Is it a school board locally, a school board diocesan wide, or is it a parish council, or is it somebody in the bishop's office? You have to follow your local rules and you need to know them. So that's all just part of the basic plan that says this is what we intend to do in general and how we intend to do it in general. And then you have your functional annexes, they call it. And this is where you set down specifically what you're going to do in various cases. There are common tasks. This is not an all-inclusive list. You might have other things on here, but they can be pre-planned and they're generally support an emergency situation. So everything from communications down to health and medical. Um, in the case of communications, and I'll mention it more than once, you should consider having an independent communication system. First thing that happens in a natural disaster, severe weather, tornado, something like that in your neighborhood, is that the local telephone system becomes saturated and it's difficult to get a call out. If your hope is that you're going to communicate with folks in your building using cell phones, you may not be able to do that because the cell phone system may be overwhelmed. If you were counting on landlines, you may not be able to do that because the landlines might be down. So a good radio system, it may be your best option. You can get good radio systems at very reasonable prices. Sometimes you can find organizations that will give you a grant to purchase those so that you can improve your safety profile in your school. So you might consider that. Section 3 then starts specific hazards that you know that you need to be prepared for. So, for instance, do you live in hurricane area? Um, as I make this presentation, we're prepared for the first hurricane to fall for landfall in Florida. Um, And it's going to be, they say, a busy hurricane season. So folks along the East Coast of the United States are probably going to be impacted heavily by hurricanes if that forecast holds true. Are you in an area where there are earthquakes, tornadoes? Um, Earthquakes can be kind of universal, but some places have more concern with earthquakes than others. If you're along one of the fault lines that we know about, you can almost be assured that you'll have some types of earthquakes, and some might be um, very serious, others might be very minor. How do you prepare for those? Tornadoes in the Midwest, I know lots of schools spend money on tornado sheltering and building schools to be tornado resistant. And there are procedures that we hope will protect our students when and if a tornado does come. And that is kind of the worst case scenario as far as weather for many of us in the Midwest. Do you live near a highway, a place that works with chemicals, or railroad track that haul chemicals? Could you have an overturned truck, uh, an overturned rail car, or an accident, an industrial accident at a plant in your vicinity, so that you might have to either shelter in place or evacuate because of the threat? And that's a very site unique probability. Um, do you live near an airport where there might be a mass casualty accident nearby? Something like that. Of course, we'll talk more about active shooters and how you might handle a person who has entered your building with the explicit purpose and goal of hurting people. We all just went through this one, pandemic and disease, and we learned that we had to be flexible in how can we have school. In my diocese, I think they did a really good job of balancing in-person versus remote learning, and the switch back and forth when it was necessary. If, for instance, someone had a suspected exposure and we wanted to be on the safe side and just have them stay home for a little while, it seemed to go very smoothly. But we had to make sure that we had a good plan that would work, and I'm sure that having been through it, we could refine that plan even a little bit better. In some cases, I remember once upon a long time ago, during the H1N1 flu uh, forecasts, that they had asked us to come up with a plan to keep the kids in school so that moms and dads could go to work, because their workforce would be hurt so badly that essential institutions like banks and factories and food outlets would have to be open, and they would have to have a place for their kids to be. And the place that they had said would be best was school. And that guidance can change from time to time, as it did when we had the recent COVID-19 incidents. So you just have to stay in tune with your public safety people and what they are recommending you should do. So next, we're going to talk about assessing the plan in these 5 areas. Okay, is it adequate? Does it identify and address critical courses? Okay, can it accomplish the assigned function? And are the assumptions valid? Is it based on solid logic? Okay, is the plan feasible? What must be done? When must it be done? And using what we have on hand. Okay, can we do it when we need to do it? And do we have what we're going to need in order to do it? Is it acceptable? Okay, can we meet the threat posed by the incident? Can we do it when it needs to be done in an efficient time frame? And does it comply with state and local rules? Is it complete? A complete plan meets these requirements. Okay, it incorporates all the courses of action. It integrates the needs of the whole school community. Provides a complete picture of what should happen, when, and at whose direction. And this is important. You don't want people just diving off into action because they might need support from something else, or they might need to be in a position to support something else. And if those things don't flow smoothly, it can create chaos or it can make matters worse. Um, you should estimate times for how long it will take you to do things. You can't, it, a common mistake when making these plans is to say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we'll be ready for that. But you don't really put any timelines in there. And so then we're ready for that becomes much more delayed than you had anticipated. Um, and it creates confusion and it creates frustration. So it's better if you know going in that you needed that time to be ready. What are the success criteria? And when can you say, okay, we did what we meant to do? Um, does it conform with the sound planning procedures? And we'll talk about the planning procedures here in just a minute. You need to make sure that your plan is compliant. And this is one that is usually not too hard to do, but basically that means that your local emergency planning organization can help you make sure that you are following all the rules and all the regulations that are present in your local jurisdiction. You don't want to get in trouble for trying to do something that you thought was the right thing to do when your local jurisdiction has said, no, don't do that, or that you must do something this way, and you didn't do it that way because you didn't know. It's easy to make sure that you're compliant, and if you ask, your local jurisdiction will review your plan with you and help you. I have talked to many, and they are more than happy to help because if your plan is a really good plan, that helps them when they have to come help you. So they're more than happy to be of assistance. And we're talking about plans. So what does this planning process look like? Well, first of all, it has these 6 steps. I won't read all the steps to you, but I will go across the top. Um, you need a collaborative team. The more people you have with the expertise that is good for safety and emergency response planning, the better. Okay. They need to have an understanding of your situation at school, what your limitations are, what your capacities are. They need to be able to determine the goals and objectives of your plan and all of the subsets of your plan. They need to clearly identify the courses of action. And here there are lots of different ways. Some people are very general. The goal is to do this. Some people are very like, do this step, this step, this step, this step. And a combination of those two approaches is probably best. You can't anticipate um, every contingency, and it is impossible, I think, to make a perfect plan. So you need training and you need understanding in order to handle those situations that are outside the planning factors that you anticipated when you built the plan. And that will happen to you, I promise. You need to plan, you make the plan, and then understand how you're going to review and who needs to approve it. Uh, who's going to look at the plan after you have it written to make sure that it's okay? And here's where you might involve your local folks again. They can tell you, well, it's a little weak here, or it's a little weak there, or this is really outstanding. Don't touch it. Leave it exactly as it is. So they can be of great help. And then finally, you implement the plan, which means everybody gets trained. Everybody knows what's in it. Everybody knows their part in what they're going to do if one of the situations addressed in the plan comes up, or if one of the generalities comes up. And then what do? You jump right back over to step number one and you start over. Now, if you're making your plan for the first time, following this model, it might be a little bit of an arduous journey, but after that, it becomes a lot easier because basically what this is all telling us after the plan is developed is let's make sure that our plan stays current. Do we need to add something? Or is something really covered elsewhere and we can drop one of the items that are listed in the plan out? has the situation inside the school or around the neighborhood changed? And we need to incorporate that and make a change to the plan. What about our evacuation sites? Are they still good? And we'll talk a little bit about evacuation sites in a minute. So as you go through your plan, here's some other things that you might consider. This is a operational risk assessment. And as you can see, this is what we use this in the service. And I still use it today as a member of the Civil Air Patrol. We have the probability of the occurrence, which is frequent, likely, occasional, seldom, or unlikely, and then the severity. So in a case of catastrophic, if it happens, it's always catastrophic. That means people are severely hurt or killed, or the building and very important infrastructure is lost. Like you have to rebuild it. If it's frequently or likely to happen, we just don't even want to go there. If you have an extremely high, you don't want to go there unless you're absolutely forced. And I have to tell you, I haven't found many situations where you're absolutely forced to do that. If it's an occasional or seldom occurrence, then you would go there if you must. Um, if it's a medium, once again, you try to avoid that when you can. Go there if you must. Um, the only one that you would want to be in is, of course, low risk. Okay, and you can see that if it's a critical factor, which means there's a large possibility of someone being hurt or something being damaged beyond repair. Um, if it's frequently, you don't want to go there. If it's likely or occasional, you don't want to go there. If it's seldom, go if you must. If it's unlikely, then you can probably go there because the likelihood of it happening is so small that it's not much of a factor. Um, and you can see how the rest of that works. Now, how do we figure all of that out? Well, there is a matrix here that is with this. You brainstorm a little bit about the hazard. How likely is the hazard? How severe would it be? Um, and then you kind of rack and stack. So first you look at the risk matrix to determine the risk level, and then you list the risks under the corresponding risk level, so that you know what the ultimate risk level is. Um, can you control for the risk? Can you eliminate the risk by putting in certain safeties or certain rules? If you can do that, then you might implement the risk controls, and it might change it from a higher category to a lower category based on that. And you might be free to do that. But even after you put those things in, you want to supervise the task and make sure that you don't need to change the rules you have for how you're going to perform the task. Um, that helps you determine how safe it is or how risky it is to perform a particular task, which is always, as we know, kind of a challenge for us, right? In a little while, we'll talk about the Secret Service findings about school shootings, and they'll mention some mental health considerations. So I have two forms here for you for mental health. This is the functional analysis interview. Um, I developed this in concert with a behavioral analyst, um, a master's level behavior analyst and therapist. So the idea here is to sort of identify what the word we would use now is triggers um, behavior, and try to remove those triggers. Okay, in the psychological world, they would call them antecedents. So you describe the behavior, you look for any physiological or medical um, things that might be contributing to that behaviors or to those behaviors. You look at antecedents. So are there certain things that happen always before that? Like for instance, if somebody pokes fun at a particular kid, Do they always turn around and get very angry and then sometimes hit? Something like that. Are there places where it never ever happens? Like this particular child never has any trouble, never has any trouble in science class. Why? But they're always in trouble in PE. Why? Okay. Um, what are the operant factors? So, what is it that the child seems to get out of the misbehavior? Some people will say that attention, even bad attention, um, is always better than no attention. And so, are they doing things because you will react and they want you to react because now they know they have your attention? Or are they doing things to get a particular reward because when they behave a certain way, somebody always does a certain thing for them, and they like that thing. So they're all of those types of considerations. So this is just a general description of what is going on. Do they have skill deficits? Can we teach them a particular skill in coping that will help them do better? And you can keep this, how many times in a typical day does it happen, and how old was he or she when the behavior started? So it kind of gives you a history of what is going on with a child that you might be concerned about. And then we have an individual threat assessment. Now, this is a tool that you can use to determine if you think a student is posing a serious, serious threat um, in your school. And it's broken out. I developed this with a counselor that I worked with at one point, and we borrowed heavily from a counselor at another school who's in the public system. So, what are the details for planning? And the way this works is this square would be vague, this square would be some specifics, and this square would be a very direct, plausible, specific, very detailed threat. And of course, the more detailed it is, the more severe it is, because the more likely it is that the person has thought this through with intent. Um, how prepared are they? Is there an immediacy? Are they getting ready to do this right away? Is it just something that's banging around in their head and they're thinking about it, but they're really not sure if they would even ever do it? Um, are they planning to do this within a few hours or days? Okay. So that all makes a difference. And of course, the most immediate or the biggest danger is if it's an immediate threat. Is it lethal? Um, uh, is it anything from fighting, um, general statements about guns, and statements about guns and where they might get them is an important factor, which we'll see when we look through the Secret Service findings. Um, and do they have the ability to acquire weapons? That changes almost everything. So these things, negative emotions, resources, do they have what they need to carry out the attack? Prior violent behavior, have they been involved in a lot of things going on at school before? Um, have they been bullied or bullied? Are they bullying or being bullied? And then overall mental health, do they have other things going on at home, or are they under stress of some sort? Do they have medical issues that might play in and complicate what's happening? What kind of stress do they have? Um, and so at the end, we get a score. We put it over here in this score. And if the score is less than 9, it's probably a transient thing. It's not something you need to be highly concerned about, although you would always be watchful because something can go from transient to immediate or serious um, very quickly. So you wouldn't want to just ignore it. Um, and then you have the serious threat and the very serious threat based on the scores. Now, I will tell you in experience using this, these scores are intended to be a guide, but anytime we had anything in the serious or very serious, we didn't use it as a guide. We went to We went to a professional, had the professional interact with us and help us with that child to make sure that that child would receive a professional assessment as well as professional intervention if that assessment showed that intervention should be um, or was called for. So it's a very useful tool if you have someone that you're not sure of. A lot of us don't have enough training in psychology to be comfortable making a psychological assessment, but this is kind of a characteristics assessment, and then we can involve a mental health professional after we make this if it appears from the scoring that we really need to. If you don't have them, I recommend that you have letters of agreement with people or places that are away from your school where you can take your children if you have to take them away from the school. Now, I recommend that you have at least two. And why two? Well, if, for instance, you have a high a tanker truck um, overturn and spill hazardous chemicals, and you need to move your children to the upwind of the disaster, you don't want to go downwind because then the place you go is going to be within the vapor cloud, right? So you want to go upwind. If you only have one place to go and that place is downwind, then you're kind of stuck and you're scrambling trying to find one out. So what we recommend is that you have two and that they be in generally opposite directions from your schoolhouse and far enough away that um, there's a probability that something affecting your schoolhouse would not affect that location. And then you need to make plans for how you'll notify, how you'll get there, and you can see some of the things that are included in this. And once again, you're welcome to a copy of this as a sample. Um, as I say, I recommend that you have at least two. We had two um, when I at my last school when I retired, and we reviewed them each year, and they worked very, very well. Next is classroom emergency directions. I'm going to skip shelter signage for right now. And what we want to take a look at here is, let's see, here's the blank. Um, a lot of schools will have a safety map that just points out the door and left or right, and it says go to the um, south stairs, go down the stairs, out the kindergarten exit, and to the prayer garden at the south end of the church. Okay, well, if I work there and I'm totally familiar with campus, that makes absolutely good sense to me. I can follow those directions and not get lost. But if I'm a teacher, a substitute teacher who's in Miss Murphy's class for the first time this year, um, and somebody just showed me up to the room, and I'm looking all around, and I'm on the third floor, and I don't have a clue. So it's really good to provide specific instructions based on the assumption that whoever needs these instructions has never seen them before. And if you're on staff and you've been through the procedures many times, you probably don't even need the instructions. At that point, the instructions are there for the occasional visitor who we want to make sure gets out of the building safely, or the occasional sub who's in charge of the kids. And everybody says, well, the kids will know what to do. Um, Probably, but it will help the sub to make sure maybe the kids are out of place and maybe they're young enough that they forget, or maybe it's only the fourth or fifth day of school and they don't know the routine yet. So it's really good to have um, specific instructions. If we take a look at the next page on this one, you can see it's for room 205. That's good because it has the room number inside the room. So whoever's reading this knows I am in room 205, and that's important. Um, it has specific instructions for what to do for fire and a tornado or severe weather, where you're going to go down. It is marked and color coded for the fire or the shelter area, so you know where to go. Okay. And you can set this up for different rooms. This is 206, 207. They shared a wing. And it's very easy with modern drawing tools to have a diagram of your building. Everything doesn't necessarily have to be to scale. The closer to scale you make it, the better, um, because that will help you make sure that everybody gets to where you want them to go. Let's see, hang on here. This always happens to me. I may have to stop and restart. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Hang on here just a second. Ah, here we are. We're back. Now let me see if I can get my notes back. Okay. Now I'm going to have to stop for a minute and then get back. So hang on. We'll restart. Those are my granddaughters, by the way, in a magnolia tree in my front yard. And sorry about this delay. I'll have us back on track here in a second. And here we go. Okay. Sorry about the delay. Now we have to find the right slide and get where we want to be. Okay. So we're right here. I can provide you with some shelter signage, um, but once again, the point is the same. If I am in your building for the first time, and I am there to sub as a room parent to help out, as just a general volunteer to do something, and we have an emergency situation and I'm the last one in the hall, everybody else has gone their way. Maybe I was in the back room in the closet, the supply closet, didn't hear, and everybody left. And here I come out and I'm like, uh-oh, where'd everyone go? So if you have the proper signage pointing the way to the shelter area in your hallways, that would be helpful. Okay, and things like perhaps a parent night at the school when the school is very crowded, and you need to have people who know where to go. Up high along the ceiling where everyone can see them is the best place for that type of signage. And I would put that up, except the same thing happens with that if I try to open that. So next, let's turn to school violence. And sadly, extreme school violence is not new. Um, Way back in 1764, um, there was a massacre of school children. Uh, Only two children survived, so 10 out of 12, along with their schoolmaster, um, excuse me, 9 out of 11, along with the schoolmaster, were killed when Native Americans in the Pontiac War attacked um, the schoolhouse. And there was a dispute over whether or not the schoolhouse was on the tribe's property, and the tribe tried to convince the settlers to move, and the settlers wouldn't move. And there was another incident between the tribe and the settlers, and the response was to attack the schoolhouse and force them to move. So that's the unfortunate beginning of things like that in what was to become the United States. In 1840, there was law professor was shot by one of his students and died from his wounds at the University of Virginia. Okay, apparently the student himself was also shot as the professor returned fire, but lived. Even here in my hometown in Kentucky, as far back as 1853, we had a student who attacked a teacher um, who survived because the student felt like the teacher had applied severe punishment to the student's brother the day before. So there are some really high profile incidents, and we have fairly complete information regarding several of them. Incidents 8 and 9 were still being investigated at the time that I put all of this together, and I haven't had a chance to read their reports yet. So um, it's important to note though that Columbine and Sandy Hook were two that changed everything as far as how we respond. Okay. Um, Generally, communities are really traumatized by these things. I worked right down the road from Heath High School in Heath, Kentucky. It's a town outside of Paducah in the far western part of the state. And school safety was very much on everybody's mind in that area because they had been through it. They had seen what happens when bad people um, bring weapons to school with the explicit intent of causing as much harm as they can cause um, that day. So it's something that was traumatic to that um, community and remains traumatic to all of the communities. That is the one thing they have in common. So the Secret Service did an assessment, which in 2019, which they published, and there were 10 findings. Um, so let's take a look at their 10 findings from their report on the national threat of violence in school. First of all, there's no profile of the student or attacker, nor is there a profile for the type of school that has been targeted, which is rather remarkable. They're everywhere, everything from a little one-room Amish schoolhouse, as you might recall, to large urban high schools. The attackers varied in age, race, gender, um, academic level, and social characteristics. And by social characteristics, they mean like how many friends did they have and things like that. No identifiable profile for the school. As I say, they're everything from large urban to single school country, a single room country schoolhouse. So the finding was that rather than focus on the set of traits and characteristics, a threat assessment process should focus on gathering relevant information about a student's behaviors, situational factors, and circumstances to assess the risk of violence and other harmful outcomes. And that interview format that I shared with you earlier is a tool that I think would help with that. And you may have others available to you in your district. Um, but the best thing to do would be to contact some competent professionals that you have confidence in who can help you develop a methodology of thinking your way through these situations that most of us don't have a whole lot of training on until we do something like that. Attackers usually had multiple motives, and the most common involving a grievance of or a grievance with classmates. And so sometimes it was school staff who had been unfair. Sometimes it was something romantic, the new boyfriend or the new girlfriend who was shot by the old boyfriend or the old girlfriend out of jealousy. Um, and relationships or other kinds of personal issues. And they don't identify what the other personal issues might be. Other motives included a desire to kill or seek fame or notoriety. And unfortunately, this is one that happens a lot. Um, and these folks, in my opinion, although I am not a healthcare professional, um, are the ones who are the most unbalanced. They seek simply fame, and you'll notice I will never use a name of one of the attackers in a schoolhouse, just for that very reason. I don't want to give them um, the notoriety of even remembering their name because I think what they did was evil, and I'm not going to give them credit for that except to identify the fact that the harshness of their behavior and their attack. So the recommendation is based on that, discovering a student's motive in concerning behavior is critical to assessing the student's risk of engaging. And once again, that risk assessment can help you do that along with the functional analysis interview. Um, so we can apply appropriate interventions to change behaviors and manage risk. And this is the crux. You'll see this a lot through the other findings. Change behavior, identify interventions, change behavior, and manage risk. That really is the best way for us to prevent um, known or armed intruders that we know the school. Most attackers used firearms, and firearms were most often acquired from the home. And we need to point out that the attackers were able to access the firearms of their parents or another close relative in most cases, or in many of the cases. And some of those firearms were unsecured, some were well secured, and they managed to bypass the securities and safeties. So this is something that you have to be aware of. And the other is it should be noted that some used knives or other weapons. For instance, in Columbine, they constructed bombs, very large bombs that would have done tremendous destruction had they gone off. Thankfully, the Columbine um, perpetrators were very bad at constructing those devices, so they made them so that they could not have gone off, which is lucky for the folks at Columbine and their families, because the carnage would have been much worse at Columbine if those bombs had gone off where they had been placed. There's a threat assessment should explore if a student has access to any weapons. As I mentioned on the threat assessment, any weapons with a particular focus on weapons at home. And secondly, parents, schools, law enforcement should work together to restrict access to weapons to those cases where students pose a risk of harm to themselves or others. And this is where you really have to get mom and dad involved. If they believe that they need to have their weapons at home, are the safeties and security of those weapons sufficient to keep the kiddo or kiddos from getting their hands on them? If they're not confident that they can prevent that, is it possible for them to temporarily turn the weapons in to a trusted person away from the house, either law enforcement or an organization of some sort that can make sure the weapons are secure and they're unavailable until other interventions can be applied? Most attackers had experienced psychological, behavioral, or developmental symptoms. And the observable mental health symptoms prior to the attacks were in these three categories. Um, I'll let you read those. I will point out that ADD and ADHD were not, um, they're mentioned here, but they were not considered causative. They were described as sort of a multiplier for kids who are already suffering um, behavioral issues or really any of the psychological or neurological development issues. If ADD is present, it may, not always, but may um, be the tipping thing that would push them into behavior that they didn't think out or process properly, and so that they go um, eh, towards the more violent solutions to their problems or worries than to something that's more thoughtful, or it leads them to bypass seeking help as opposed to going after help with what's bothering them. So it's not causal. It's not causal. We don't need to worry about kids with ADD and ADHD being violent and dangerous in school. I don't want you to think that's what they said there. Okay. And of course, sometimes there's a cognitive deficit or delay that makes it impossible or difficult for the perpetrator to truly understand the severity of what they are about to do. So the finding here is that, or the recommendation is that the fact that half received one or more mental health services prior to the attack indicates that mental health evaluations and treatment should be considered a component of multidisciplinary threat assessment, but not a replacement. Okay, so you need to integrate the mental health evaluation to kids who show a history that is present in um, people that come to shoot up schools. And a second was that mental health professionals should be included on the collaborative team, and that these two go hand in hand. Okay, um, mental health professional, teachers, administrators, law enforcement, and parents. Okay, all of those people need to be involved when a kid is being assessed um, as to the danger they might pose in school. Half the attackers had interest in violent topics. And this was a hard one to judge sometimes. Um, and the example they use here is Hitler. Um, one of the kids at Columbine was fixated on Hitler and how Hitler was such a heroic figure. Um, Sometimes they study these things and or they participate in what we would call first person shooters, first person shooter games, FPS games. Um, but if you're interested in Hitler because you think you want to study how a single person can influence people to do grave harm and how that is evil, that's one thing. If you are interested in Hitler because you think he was a misunderstood hero, that's quite another. And there are people who pick up on violent characters like Manson uh, and folks who commit high profile crimes. And those who think of them as heroes um, are displaying a problematic behavior. So we need to be mindful of them and try to figure out why they think that and maybe try to redirect that behavior a little bit. Violent interests without explanation are concerning, and they mean should be limited to or should not hesitate to initiate further information gathering and assessment. So, in other words, when students show this type of unexplained interest in violent behavior, you should take a look at that very closely because it may be the precursor of their actually um, committing very violent behavior. All attackers experience social stress involving their relationship with peers and or romantic partners. So they had stress in their lives, and this is a very, very interesting point. At least once in 6 months, and over half of them had that very heavy stress within 2 days before the attack. So we need to be on watch for kids who show a very sudden change of behavior and try to address that. I know it's difficult in the hubbub of everyday activity that's going on in a school, but if you notice a child who was happy on Monday and Tuesday, and all of a sudden on Wednesday is just almost on the verge of tears or very depressed all day long, you might be sure to ask them what's going on and give them an outlet so that it doesn't do or turn to other avenues. And if you hear or see something that would warrant it, you might get some other people involved, like a counselor and or some mental health professionals from outside the school. Social stressors, other stressors were included families, conflicts of home, and there's more about this in another finding, or academic or disciplinary actions, or other personal issues. They didn't mention exactly what those were, but there was a range of things. So the recommendation is that school personnel should be trained to recognize signs of a student in stress, for sure, and that additional training should focus on crisis intervention, teaching students skills to manage emotions and resolve conflicts, and suicide prevention. And that's what we were discussing earlier. It's hard to do that because we're not always necessarily trained for it. Um, but it might be to our benefit if we found the time and the opportunity within our schools to be trained that way. Nearly every attacker experienced negative home life factors. So that can be anything from divorce, drug use, or criminal charges with family members, or even domestic abuse. And this one is green because it's a finding, but not necessarily a causal finding. So this is just notes for how to address that. They're not predictors, but research has identified an association between many of these and factors and many of these factors and a range of negative outcomes for children. So the point here being that the negative home life won't necessarily cause a student to behave violently. However, um, the negative home life added on to other factors can once again be one of those tipping point um, factors that would sort of push a student over the edge into more violent behavior if the than if the home life factors were not present. So it's not that every kid with a tough home life is going to be violent, but it is that situation has the potential to make it worse if there are other factors that are involved that are serious in and of themselves. Most attackers were victims of bullying, which was often observed by others. And this is the part that I find um, troubling more than anything. They were bullied by their classmates. Over half of them were bullied, appeared to be a persistent pattern, which lasted for weeks, months, or years, which of course is the very definition of bullying. It's long term. Okay. So their recommendation is that it's critical that schools implement comprehensive programs designed to promote safe and positive school climates, and where students feel empowered to report bullying when they witness it or are victims of it, and where school officials and other authorities act to intervene. And there are lots of good programs relative to bullying. Excuse me. Peace Builders is one that I know, and Olveus is one that I know. So there are lots of um, opportunities and there are lots of programs that will help you. But the most critical factor in all those bullying um, approaches is consistency throughout the school. And sorry to say, sometimes the bully is not a student. Sometimes it is an adult, and either an aide, unfortunately, a teacher, perhaps sometimes, whose behavior in the classroom is perceived as bullying by the children in that classroom. And we need to address that teacher professionally. If that's the case, um, nobody's perfect. And so if somebody slides into that, hopefully they're professional enough when you point it out to them. They're like, oh, yeah, wow, I hadn't thought of that, but thank you for letting me know. And I'll make a change on that immediately. So we want to get that away and make sure that whatever the approach is used, that it's as universal as you can make it within your school. Because if it's not, it won't work. Um, yeah, if there are people who get away with it, then it won't work. And there are many interesting statistics about how student reaction to witnessing bullying influences the behavior of the bullies. And so, if students are empowered to speak up right away, that is one of the most effective tools to eliminating bullying activities. Most attackers had a history of school disciplinary actions, and many had prior contact with law enforcement. So most of them were in trouble, um, and sometimes they were suspended. Um, Sometimes they were suspended and had to have the police called. Important point is that punitive measures are not preventable, or preventive. Um, so in other words, punishing somebody doesn't prevent what is happening. Okay. If they pose a risk of harm to themselves or others, removing them from school may not always be the safest option. Maybe an in school suspension where you can supervise them and apply some um, interventions at school, like counseling, meeting with a mental health professional, or maybe if you have a school resource or a DARE officer available, just a frank conversation about you don't really want to go down this road because you have more potential than ending up in jail, things like that. The recommendation is to make the determination regarding appropriate discipline. Schools should employ disciplinary practices that ensure fairness and transparency. In other words, everybody knows what happened and why we're getting punished with the student and family, and then appropriate follow-up. So getting mom, dad, or whoever the guardians are involved, and the student to understand what we did, why it was wrong, um, how we have to make up for what we did wrong. Maybe we have to, make amends with the aggrieved party. If the aggrieved party is the general social um, community, then how do we make that up in school to make amends for having committed that transaction? And really getting the child to own up and own um, their mistake. So it can be difficult, but it may be the best option. Um, it's important to point out that oftentimes the shooters weren't supposed to be there. Um, Marjorie Tillman, that shooter was not supposed to be there. At Sandy Oaks, that person was not supposed to be there. At Columbine, that person was, or those guys were not supposed to be in school that day. They'd been suspended. So suspending them didn't protect the school or the students. So that's important to remember. All attackers exhibited concerning behaviors. Most elicited concern from others, and most communicated their intent to attack. Oh, wow. People knew what they were planning. That's amazing. So a constellation of low-level concerns. So that's a constellation means there are just many concerns that they were low level. Um, and then they liked, they were engaged in prohibited behaviors. Okay. Um, Most communicated their threat to their target or communicated the intentions to carry out the attack to someone. And in many cases, someone observed the threat and did not act either out of fear. This is one, not believing the attacker. They're just blowing off steam or venting, right? They misjudged the immediacy or the location. In other words, they didn't really believe that they meant it. Okay, they're really mad, and yeah, they could, but they really don't mean it because they just aren't going to do anything. That's just too awful. Um, or they thought they could talk them out of it. So, hey, sit down. Hey, you really don't want to do that. You're my friend. That just sounds like the goofiest thing. Don't do that. It would be dumb. Or it would be so mean you get in so much trouble. And of course, some of them want to get in trouble because that's how they get famous. So things like that. Um, well-meaning, but it doesn't work. So students, school personnel, and family members should be encouraged to report troubling or concerning behaviors to ensure that those in positions of authority can intervene. You need to do that as soon as you can. Okay. So with with all of that in mind, now that's after the fact. Let's take a look at Sandy Hook um, as an example of one of the watershed. As I said, Sandy Hook and Columbine were the two watershed events that changed everything. Sandy Hook's a little less complex than Columbine, so we're going to use that just in the interest of time. So here's the timeline for Sandy Hook. There are two slides here. So the first call to 911 is at 9:35:39. So 9:35 and a half. The first call is to Newtown. Now that call came after the perpetrator had shot his way through a high strength glass door, standard glass door for school. All the school doors were locked with a high caliber weapon. The counselor and the principal heard the commotion, went out to the hallway to just check and see what all the noise was about. And whereupon they encountered the shooter and they were killed immediately. So the shooter has been in the building for a while, and then someone in the office um, who was behind them ran back into the office and called 911, hid behind the desk, called 911. So it's already about a minute inside the building, okay, with the weapon. So you can see here the dispatch goes out at 9:36. That's really fast. Okay, that's only a matter of a few seconds. The Connecticut State Police respond in about a minute and a half later. Um, the Connecticut State Police are told that the school is in lockdown. So by 9:38, almost 9:39, we know that the school has issued a lockdown order and that they have called the police and told them that they're in lockdown, right? 9:39, the first Newtown police officer arrives. So 35, excuse me, to 39, okay, about 3.5 minutes. That's important. Remember that number, 3.5 minutes. The first police officer arrives. Okay. And then shortly thereafter, two more police officers arrive. They hear gunshots and head in, uh, or they hear gunshots. They head around to the back of the building. Now, next slide. Um, they encountered an unknown male running along the east side with something in his hand. They thought that he might be the shooter. It turns out that he wasn't. At 9:40, they hear the last shot. Now, later, after the fact, they figure out um, that the that was in classroom number 10. The last shot was a suicide by the shooter. At 9:41, still there's nobody in the building. Shooter's dead now, along with lots of kids and teachers. The information is relayed to the location of the last known gunshots heard. Okay, 9:41, they have the unknown male prone on the ground, and they are told that there's just one shooter inside the building. So this fellow cannot be the shooter. Okay, they do note the license plate of the shooter's car. He drove there. So at 9:44, the Newtown officers enter the building. So 9:44, they enter the building, and that is 9 minutes after the um, the first call. Okay, and it's 6 minutes and 75 seconds after arriving on site. 9 minutes after the first call, 6 and 3/4 minutes after arriving on site. Remember those numbers. Okay, they're important. So what was the common practice at the time? Did they violate any rules? People were, what are you doing? What are you doing? Well, the common practice before and how officers were trained is that you arrive, you secure the area, you assess the situation. That is, you try to figure out how many people are involved, where they are, where they might be headed, um, and where all the victims or potential victims might be. You try to find the shooter, and if possible, you negotiate, talk them down, and get them out of there. And then you, all this time, you're waiting for backup. You're not going to enter until you can apply overwhelming force, so that you can put an end to what's going on, um, with as little risk of life to the responders as possible, and making sure that when you do enter the building, you put an end to it. And when I ask my police officer friends, what do you mean by put an end to it? Well, either they surrender, or if they fight, we shoot them. And I'll tell you, share some news about whether or not they'll surrender in a minute. Then they would wait in this standard process. They would wait for EMS, and they needed help victims who could be reached easily. And then, as they could advance into the building, they would help more and more. So after Sandy Hook and after Columbine, they changed the practices. These first ones, 1A and B, are pretty much the same. Okay, you get there, you do a quick assessment of what's the danger. You call for backup if you know you're going to need it, right? Number two begins a significant change. Here, rather than waiting for overwhelming force, law enforcement are now trained, move to engage the shooter. And what that means is they'll bypass injured people to get to the shooter. If you're wounded and laying on the ground and you have a life-threatening injury, they are not going to stop to help you. They are going after the shooter. Law enforcement is going after the shooter, because while they take time to help you, the shooter shoots many more people. So the idea is to stop the carnage. And they are going to put their life in danger, one on however many is in there, one on one, one on three, one on two. They're going to go after the shooter or shooters. As a medical team responds, they will enter the building only under armed escort, and then triage and treat the injured. And of course, by triage, they're going to treat the most severely injured persons that they can get to safely, first, and try their best to prevent any further loss of life. Law enforcement will control or subdue the shooters, and then they will respond to others as needed. So this is the general practice now. And if you see, there's a little bit of difference. Okay, we don't wait for backup, and we don't spend all this time from the time of arrival to the time of entry waiting for overwhelming force. They get right in there and they get after, um, the attacker. Okay. So, what are your considerations as you go through this? And there are some startling things that they've discovered. The average shooter shoots someone every 12 to 15 seconds. Remember that time I asked you to remember 6 minutes, 9 minutes? 12 to 15 seconds is 4 to 5 people a minute. Okay, so 5 minutes is 20 people, 6 minutes is 24 people, maybe 25. Okay, average police response times in the United States, and these are generally published response times. They are not response times to school shootings, and it's important that you know that. Um, my conversations with police officers are, unless they are involved in another life-threatening or life saving situation, um, they're going to drop what they're doing and respond to the area. If they're writing a traffic ticket on somebody, that driver is going to get it off because they're going to drop the ticket and they're going to jump in the car and head for school. And as one policeman put it, um, I have kids in school, and I hope the closest officer to my kid's school will do the same thing for me. I'm going to go and I'm going to do my best to protect those kids, um, which is wonderful to hear from policemen. So they say, I talked to policemen in Florence and Louisville. They say they'd be closer to the 5 minute, maybe 4 minute mark, depends on where they are before they could get to the school. But 4 minutes, remember this number, 4 minutes. It's a lot of time when somebody's shooting people. The other startling piece of information is that most of the shooters, very few of them are captured. Most of the shooters tend to surrender. Um, excuse me, very few of them fight back. Most of them tend to surrender or suicide as soon as they're challenged by law enforcement or an armed person. So they either drop their gun, or if they're into the glory and suicide, they'll shoot themselves. They have there's no known instance where they engaged in a firefight that I'm aware of with law enforcement when law enforcement arrived on the building or on the site. So let's take a look at Parkland. Um, the shooter entered. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was familiar with the building. He knew where he could cause trouble. Went back and forth on the first floor. He entered at 221, and he went up the stairs at 223. So he just walked straight down the floor, shooting, went up to the second floor, and he shot people up. Okay, then went up to the third floor, killed six more people who were just in the stairwell. Okay, he tried to set up a sniper position where he was going to shoot from here, but he couldn't get the windows open. So he dropped all of his things and he went down and pretended to be one of the students being evacuated from the building. Um, Now, here's something that we can point out that was in the report. It wasn't widely broadcast in the news. Quite accidentally, police entered the building and they were looking for the shooter. There are cameras all over. This is a very modern school. Cameras all over are very modernized. Um, cameras all over the place. The students were well monitored for safety. The camera operator, the person who was in the office who knew how to operate the camera, accidentally reset the camera, rewound the camera 20 minutes. And that's the picture they were looking at while they searched for the shooter and looked for activity for the shooter, um, but didn't know how to get it back to the actual live picture. So they were always looking at a replay. Um, So it became difficult for police officers to use that film, and that's how the perpetrator almost got away because he was not observed up here at point eight, where he dropped all of his stuff and ran down the stairs to pretend to be to pretend to be a student. And he almost got away with it, except one of the students, where they were lining up, saw him and said, and was wise enough to point out to a police officer, I think he was the shooter. And so they went and arrested him. And sure enough, they linked him to the shooting. His fingerprints, I guess, were all over the weapon. So it was only by fortunate circumstance that he didn't get away. Now, there'd have been a manhunt, we'd have found him, but just think of all the angst along with the suffering at the school throughout the neighborhood if he had shot people in his attempt to make his getaway. So we're glad that he got caught. But just think about things like that. Make sure that somebody can operate all the safety equipment in your office and that you have more than one person who's trained to do that, because if they are hurt or otherwise occupied helping, you need to have an alternative person that you can go to. So what became of the prevailing witnesses? Uh, there is no plan that covers everything. In the event of a shooter or shooters, situations become very complex and very fluid. And rather than a step by step response from teachers, it may be more important to have a broad and deep understanding of options and the confidence and permission to act on personal initiative to mitigate the danger. Okay, we don't know. It's not like a fire drill where you can line up and follow through. And staying in the classroom may or may not be the best option. But if you decide to leave, you have to know how to proceed through the building, because, as we say, it's not like fire drill where the hallways are safe, or that you can see the fire before you get there, right? You could walk around the corner and there's the shooter, and that would be, or could be, quite unfortunate for you. So using things like a mirror to look around corners, your local law enforcement people can train you how to do that. And depending on the age of your children in the schoolhouse, that might be a better option for you. So under some of the prevailing wisdom, notifications use clear language. I remember when the code in my school where I worked once upon a time was, Sister Mary Claire, please come to the office. Well, Sister Mary Claire, everybody who worked there for a long time knew meant that there was trouble and we should do a lockdown. But a new person didn't know. And the first time I heard it, I hadn't been briefed on that. And so I'm just walking around the hallway doing things. My door's wide open, and I'm not worried about it. And the next thing I know, somebody comes down the office and says, "Excuse me, why aren't you in your room with your door locked?" I said, "Why should I be? And is there a problem?" And they said, "Sister Mary Claire came to the office." Okay, who's she? And so we had a conversation about what that meant. Um, the other thing is, you might have people in the building who are totally unfamiliar, they're visitors, and you want them to know that they need to take cover. And using code words that they may not be familiar with is going to kind of leave them out in the cold. So um, let's use straight language to the point. Now, there is a difference between an inside and an outside threat. If we have an inside threat, we know what to do. We lock down. There's an intruder in the building. We secure all the doors and we get everyone behind a locked door. And most schools have a procedure where if kids are close to a classroom and you see them, rather than let them run down the hall, you haul them into your classroom, because in the act of running down the hall, they might run into the shooter. So you get them in your classroom, you do the things you're supposed to do to hush and hide in the corner, oh, block the window so that they can't see if there's anybody in there, and they can't see in any of the rooms. So that's one thing. Then if you have an outside situation, I was in a schoolhouse once where there was a bank robbery about 4 blocks down the street. And of course, the police called us right away, and we had some kids on the playground. It was fenced, but still they're outside. we hustled all the kids inside and we locked all the doors, and we had somebody watching each of the doors in case somebody tried to get in, they could alert us. They were doing it from a safe location where, they would be out of danger if somebody came up to the door. But we were quite concerned. And luckily, we got notice about an hour later that they had caught the robber, and as luck would have it, the robber had gone in the direction away from our school. So we were all very happy and relieved to hear that. But once again, it's if the danger is outside, you need to have thought through how you're going to hustle people in and how you're going to let them know that you need to get them inside. So when you do have an active shooter, of course, your first priority is preserving life. Okay. Um, then you can escape if possible. Block the doors. You should prepare to fight if you have that capacity, because if the intruder tries to get into your door, that fighting, regardless of how ineffective you think it might be, is going to be better than just being there and being a target, an easy target for the shooter. Um, a little bit of fight, even if you're not entirely successful, um, the delay might make the shooter decide to leave and go someplace else, because the thing they're looking for is easy, easy targets. They don't want a target that fights back, because they're essentially trying to cause as much as they can, mayhem as they can cause. And being in a fight with one group of people is not what they're interested in. So um, being prepared to fight is important. And then you can listen for instructions and make sure that you do the things that people are telling you to do. Escape is always preferable, okay? Sometimes a slow, cautious movement towards a safe place. You're probably not going to know where the shooter is. Once again, if you have a mirror or other reflective device, you can look around corners. You need to train students and others that this is not the same as a fire evacuation. Um, and do you have a breaker tool or something like that to break out windows if you're on a first floor? And you're not sure that it's safe to go in the hallway. If it's safer outside the building, perhaps you break the window and you have everybody run out or go out the window, knowing where they will assemble when they get outside. Doors can be very good barriers. And I will say that I am unaware of any school shooter that tried to enter through a locked door. Okay. So they just are not going to take the time generally. As I say, they're looking for easy targets. They want to go up and down the hallway, go up and down the stairs, and find people who are unprotected, and go after them, because those are the easy targets. However, uh, doors are sometimes problematic. If somebody were to want to attack your doors, the easiest thing to do for most of the doors, if you don't have reinforced hinges, is to simply shoot at the hinges. You can shoot at each hinge with a high powered rifle or even a high caliber pistol. Um, and in a matter of seconds, you've ruined the hinges, and you can simply push the door down. It'll fall down into the room. So doors, as I say, generally provide a really good barrier, but they can be not as safe as we think if somebody has decided that they want to attack a particular classroom. Okay, they can be made more effective. You can do some strengthening of the hardware and things like that. You can talk to your local disaster preparedness folks. They'll be glad to do a survey for your school and show you what to do. Um, of course, inward and outward opening doors need different types of protection. Um, Barriers in front of the doors or attached to the doors may not be an answer, because it may violate your local code. So you want to, once again, check with your local authorities as you make these types of modifications to your building. And once again, there's no known instance that I'm aware of where a shooter attempted to breach a locked door. Now, they did try to get into some doors that were being closed, and people were there. At the University of Virginia, the shooter tried to enter a classroom where the students were not able to lock the door, and they were holding it closed. And it was just by luck that someone came along while he was trying to get in there and scared him off. So he could have caused a lot of damage in that room because it was about a half full classroom. So here's an example, some barriers you can put in front of the door. Pile anything you got up there. Okay. This is an idea of being ready to fight if the person gets past the barrier in the door. Now, I wouldn't do what these guys are doing, and it looks to me from this picture like they're standing right in front of the door. If the perpetrator decides to shoot straight through the door, I think they might be in a little bit of trouble. So once again, talk to your folks in your law enforcement. They can help you do this without putting yourself into a a worse situation. Okay. So there are some programmed responses that you can look at. Three of them are ALICE, armed faculty, and armed law enforcement, and I'll discuss each of those here. ALICE is for alert, lockdown, inform, confront, or evacuate. It's a well-established program. It's been around for a long time. You can you can Google an ALICE person that might be qualified to train near your location. Most of your law enforcement or disaster preparedness folks can help you with this. Probably a sheriff or police department would be your best bet. Um, and the idea is just to let everybody know, lock down, um, confront a person who is trying to, if they try to enter your room, be ready to throw things at them, do all sorts of things. As I mentioned, any kind of a fight is likely to make them back out and go someplace else. And if that happens every room they go into, every time you do that, it delays them and they're not shooting someone. And it gives the responders more time to get there, and it lowers the amount of carnage that the shooter can cause, which is always what we want to do, right? Hopefully we could get it to zero. Um, because I unfortunately it's never happened to me, but I know some people who are close to families who have suffered from that sort of thing, and I I cannot imagine what would go through my head if I had that experience, um, even having been in the service. It would just be awful for me, and I can't imagine the people who have actually had to suffer their feelings and the trauma that it has caused them. Another option is armed faculty. And I will say this is pretty controversial. Um, Many states allow concealed carry at school, um, and that would be with with the principal or the school administrator's permission. Um, Specifically trained faculty, not just anybody who's gone to a concealed carry class. Um, And the reason people are considering this is to remember the statistics earlier about shooting and what happens in the time frame of the shooting. 4 to 5 people shot every minute, a 5 to 10 minute response time. So that's if you take the four, that's it. That's 20. If you take the five, that could be 50 people shot um, before the first police officers in the building to confront the shooter. Um, And remember also that shooters tend to suicide or surrender when they're confronted by another armed person. So if you have someone in your building who can confront the shooter, um, chances are that'll put an end to it right then and there. There's a major concern with training, and I totally agree with that. As a former service member, I am comfortable with weapons. I use weapons. I am comfortable and confident in my ability to use one and to hit what I shoot at. I had a faculty member at one point who had just retired, As a police officer, um, I would have been very confident to have that person armed in my school, um, because he would know exactly how. He's very highly trained, of course, as a police officer, knows how to use a weapon and knows how to make sure that he hits what he's shooting at, which is one of the issues when you have weapons in the school. Um, we kind of joked around. The last thing we wanted to do would be to, give a weapon to the equivalent of Barney Fife, if you remember him in that old TV show. Um, but it's a serious concern. There is a training program called Post, and I was in one jurisdiction where the county sheriff liked it so much that he was willing to pay for teachers to go to have that training, and it was extensive training. He um, said that the sheriff advised us all at a big public meeting that it was more uh, training than some police departments would get in small jurisdictions, but that it was absolutely equivalent to anything that a police department or a police officer or a sheriff's officer would receive, so that the people who come out of that program are well trained and well qualified to carry a weapon and to use the weapon effectively. Um, but there's a bigger consideration as well. While I would feel comfortable having a weapon, and I'm sure my police officer friend would feel comfortable having a weapon. There's the larger consideration of the community as a whole. Um, there's some people are very concerned about weapons in school, and they are very concerned about the possible or the possibility for unintentional consequences in school. So before you would think about anything like this, make sure that your community is on board with it. And when I say community, I mean moms, dads, faculty, parish, that the diocese would allow it, that your pastor is okay with it. Everybody needs to be on board with it, because you don't want people sending their kids to school afraid for what might happen because somebody in the school has a weapon, even though that weapon is for self-defense. So that is the controversial part of it. At some places, it's like the communities are like, yes, we want our teachers armed. And some communities are so adamant about it, if you're not willing to allow one of your colleagues to be armed, perhaps you need to go work someplace else, because we're going to protect our kids. And if you're not on board with that, well, thank you and goodbye. So as I say, it's a controversial approach. So if you decide to think about it very carefully and make sure that the whole community is comfortable with it. The other option is armed law enforcement. Now, Florida, I'm going to skip right down to here, tried to they have a law now where schools can hire a retired law enforcement officer uh, to work uh, in school, simply like a guard, an armed guard for the kids. And since they're retired law enforcement, they have to keep up their training, and they have to stay proficient with the use of their weapons. That's part of the program. But they had a problem. They have 3,000 schools down there, but they only had 1,500 people that met the qualifications. Now, there were physical, mental, and agility, can you shoot and aim type or considerations to that. They had a hard time finding enough people who were eligible. They could only find about half of what they needed. So it's in theory, a lot of people like this idea. We have armed guards guarding our money, um, and they don't feel like having armed guards guarding our kids is a bad thing. Um, and if you were to ask me if it came down to my kids or grandkids and all the money I got, I'll give you all my money. Just make sure that my kids come home today. So that's That's where these people are. Um, but like I say, it's an extra paid position. It's expensive, especially for private schools. Um, and so a lot of people don't like it. Some local jurisdictions will provide um, limited availability of school resource officers. Sometimes they have a single school resource officer who would be assigned to say, 2 or 3 schools, so they're not there all the time. And even when they are assigned, they're away often because they have to go to training and do things like that to keep up with their ability to perform their duty as a law enforcement officer, because that's their primary function as law enforcement officer. So those are some programs. So as we close or get close to closing, let's go through some general considerations for your plan, and then we'll be done. So first of all, remember, there's no such thing as a perfect plan. And what you need to consider is your capacity to respond, the physical facilities, the training equipment, location, all that stuff. Um, with whom do you need to coordinate? Start with your local fire chief, I would recommend, because fire departments are usually much more concerned about the general nature of emergency response. That's a generalization. It might not be true in every jurisdiction. What about your after duty activities? Okay, is there someone designated to direct a response? Do you have, for instance, playing fields, things like that? Um, you have somebody to monitor the weather when people are playing outside, like a thunderstorm that might brew up in the middle of the soccer game or football game. Um, do you have ready access to a shelter area for people who are there? Or they just have to run to their cars and hope that the hailstones aren't big enough to break the windows? Have you discussed what you would do at Mass? Mass is where we always get together. In Catholic schools, usually everybody meets in Mass once a week, and the whole school is there, and the doors are open. Why? Because it's Mass, it's church. We want people to come. And we have invited grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, families, and then there are many parishioners who come to Mass at that time. Many schools have the parish Mass and the school Mass in the morning at the same time. So the church is totally open. The unfortunate truth is that there are shootings and attacks at churches, and you read about them all the time. So, what would you do if somebody entered your church? There are no walls to hide behind. There are no rooms to go to, or not very many that are going to hold very many people. What would you do? And how would you respond to that shooter? It would be very important for you to get hold of your local law enforcement folks and ask them to come and check you out and see what you can do and talk you through an appropriate response for what happens if you're a church. Because if all you do is duck down and somebody's there with multiple loaded weapons, there are going to be a lot of people hurt. And what do you do to stop that or to mitigate that? That's an important consideration that you should have in your plan. Do you have an independent communication system? You mentioned earlier, public systems tend to get overwhelmed in the event of a natural disaster of wide scale or scope. So radios is a really good alternative to your cell phones and things like that. You might lose power, so you can't depend on internet and stuff like that to communicate, or your phone line might go down, your landline. So a good radio system is a probably a great investment. They're useful every day, but in an emergency, they're just as valuable as gold. So I would encourage you to get one. How much water do you have on hand if you have to keep the kids overnight? So if there is a large scale weather event that keeps parents from getting to school to get the kids, maybe there's power lines down everywhere, and or the weather is going to be one of those things that has cropped up and is going to stay. and you weren't able to send all the kids home, you have some now who are stuck here with you at school and they cannot get out, and their parents cannot get in. So how are we going to take care of those? Or that a handful or the whole school? How much water do you have? And you can see how much you need for boys or girls, men and women. Um, can you access food in the cafeteria? You're going to have to eat something if you're going to have to spend the night. So at least you should have the keys. And I know a lot of schools don't keep a huge amount of food at the cafeteria. They have deliveries multiple times a week, but you should have some. And at least you wouldn't have to go hungry if you can cook. That is assuming that you can cook. And if not, maybe you have sandwiches, sandwich meats, and breads that you could use. How many days of medicine do you have? You can think of um, students who maybe are diabetic, and if they have to stay the night, do they have enough? Um, or if you have to hold on to them because they cannot get home. So, um, do you have everything they need in order to stay the night? And if anybody's on prescriptions where they're supposed to take them every few hours, do you have enough that you could give them medicine through the night if you had to until the next day? Do you have formal letters of agreement for evacuation? If not, you should work on those sites and work them up, and you can use the sample that's in this package. How often do you tabletop? Have you ever tabletop like your response to a large scale disaster, like tornado, for instance, where you're going to have to evacuate the building because part of it was hurt or damaged and it's unsafe for you to stay? Um, do you have an alternative location? And how are you going to get the kids home to their parents and control traffic in and out so that you know for sure that every child is accounted for and that every child is given to the correct person? So you should practice those things, at least in the tabletop and then in the real world. Could visitors find your shelter area? If someone presents, is someone present who is proficient in the use of the camera system? So don't repeat that mistake at Douglas High School in Florida. A little bit about building signage. Remember all the external doors. Start from the alpha side, which is where the main entrance is, and then go counterclockwise, starting over at each side. And the alpha side, A side is the main entrance, and then Bravo or B side is the next corner or is around the next corner, and so on until you get back to the alpha side. Put room numbers in your windows so that somebody who's not familiar with the building layout can look for the room numbers if they're looking for a location where somebody is stuck or needs help. Number the doors on both sides so that that substitute who's there for the first time remembers that Mrs. Murphy's room is also room 303. Number your stairs so that people are very clear about which ones are usable and which ones are not. To do all of this, you can contact your local FEMA fire EMS people. They'll be glad to take that phone call. That is one of their primary purposes. And as I have said a couple times already in this program, they will be glad to help you because by helping you, they help themselves. When you are more prepared and they arrive and you are prepared for what they're going to do, that helps them smoothly integrate and take command in the situation and execute all of the things that they need to execute in order to keep the situation as safe as possible and return it to use as soon as possible. You can go to FEMA for grants and training. You can talk to the Weather Service for training on things like weather. They have a program called a Weather Safe School. Um, it's a really good program. It will even teach you how to recognize weather phenomena. You can qualify as a weather spotter if you want. Um, but even if you don't do that, if you take the class, you can go outside and see what's coming so that you're more aware if that severe storm is coming your way or not. And then you can go to your local police and sheriff for violent incidents. So that really wraps us up. And so I hope we got here to where we wanted to discuss. I know this one's a little bit long, but there's so much to cover in this area. I didn't want to skip a lot of that because I think it's important for you to know. Please feel free to contact me at this address. I want to thank you for everything you do. Um, Working in schools looks so easy from people who just see us do what we do. But the reason it looks so easy is because of the intense training and the effort and the emotion and that connection with the kids that we all develop. And it makes it look easy to those who don't go through all that training and effort and pre-planning and all that hard work that comes from getting to know the kids and getting to know what you're going to do later, um, when things aren't exactly as you'd hope they would be. So I appreciate your attendance at this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. Feel free to contact me if you need more. Have a great day, and I hope you're enjoying this year's Law Symposium.